If you're watching this alone right now, turn on a light. And if you want more true-style horror stories like this, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts at the end, and subscribe for more unsettling tales every week. Now, let me tell you about the tree where we buried our daughter, and what grew thereafter. They buried Lila on a Sunday morning when the summer heat had just begun to thicken the air. Thomas stood silent beside the open grave, his knuckles pale against the handle of the small white coffin. He didn't cry. He felt as though his tear ducts had burned out in the 3 days since the accident. Beside him, Elise swayed slightly as if she were about to collapse. Her hair was unbrushed, tied back with the same pink ribbon Lila used to wear. A few neighbors gathered in respectful silence under the ancient oak tree. Its wide canopy cast mottled shadows across the grass, where fallen leaves curled like old paper. Birds chirped unbothered by human grief. Elise glanced up through her tears, staring at the thick branches twisting above them, and she thought of how Lila used to call it her magic tree, the one place she would sit for hours playing with dolls and singing to herself in high lilting tones. The pastor read a quiet prayer, his voice barely cutting through the rustling breeze. Thomas didn't hear a word. His eyes remained locked on the dirt piled high beside the grave. He kept seeing the image he had tried so hard to forget. Lila's small body limp under the tires, her face turned away, one shoe flung 20 feet down the gravel driveway. He hadn't checked the mirror. He always checked. But that day he was late for work. Elise bent forward and placed a small ragged doll into the coffin before they closed it. It was Lila's favorite, its hair matted and dress torn from months of tea parties under the oak. As the coffin descended, Elise pressed trembling fingers to her lips, whispering something no one could hear. When Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, she flinched as if struck. After everyone had left, they remained there, just the two of them under the looming branches. The breeze felt cooler in the quiet. Elise kneeled, pressing her palms flat against the soil. The roots of the tree snaked beneath her hands, their ridged surfaces hard and ancient. She imagined she could feel a pulse there, a faint vibration deep within the wood. Tears dripped down her chin as she whispered, "Stay with us, baby. Please, stay." Thomas turned away. He walked back to the house, unable to look at Elise or the fresh grave. Each step felt mechanical, disconnected from his hollow chest. Inside, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Lila used to draw crooked pictures of their family. Crayons still lay scattered across the table, pink and purple and bright yellow. The silence pressed down around him until he thought his eardrums might burst. That night they didn't sleep in the same room. Elise lay curled on Lila's bed, her knees pulled to her chest, inhaling the fading scent of lavender shampoo on the pillow. Thomas lay awake in their room, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun shadows across the walls. Just past midnight he heard it, faint, muffled giggling drifting through the open window. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was light, musical, Lila's laugh. He squeezed his eyes shut so tight it hurt. When he opened them again, the room was silent. Morning came heavy and gray. Fog lay thick over the yard, curling around the oak's gnarled trunk. Thomas poured coffee into a chipped mug and stared out the kitchen window. The fresh grave was just visible beneath the tree's lower branches. Something caught his eye, a small speck of green on the rough brown bark. He squinted, leaning forward. A bud. Bright, impossibly vivid green, sprouting from the base of the trunk where they had laid her to rest. A single droplet of dew clung to its tip, quivering in the breeze. Elise appeared beside him, her eyes rimmed with swollen red. She followed his gaze and her lips parted in a trembling smile. "Look," she whispered, voice thin with wonder. "She's becoming part of it. Maybe she really did become one with the tree." Thomas didn't answer. He sipped his coffee, bitter and lukewarm, feeling it slide down into the emptiness of his gut. Outside, the bud shifted slightly in the breeze as if nodding in agreement. The branches above seemed to sigh, the rustling leaves forming a whisper too quiet to understand. That evening, Elise sat cross-legged beneath the oak, her back pressed against its wide trunk, humming softly as she watched the bud. The sky burned with the crimson hues of sunset, bleeding gold and violet across the yard. Thomas stood by the porch, hidden in the shadows, watching her rock back and forth as though cradling an invisible child. He shivered despite the warmth of the dying day. When night fell, she remained outside, humming lullabies into the darkness. Thomas lay awake, listening to the low melody carry through the open window. Just before dawn, as the first gray light pressed against the horizon, he drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. In his dreams, Lila ran through tall grass, her hair tangled with leaves, her eyes dark and bottomless as she turned to look at him and whispered, "Daddy, help me grow." The sun rose slow and pale. Thomas awoke with the echo of her words lingering in his chest, heavy and cold. He stumbled to the window and looked out at the tree. The bud had opened slightly overnight, revealing the hint of something pale within its folds. Elise was already there, kneeling in the wet grass, her head bowed low as she whispered to the tree. A crow landed on one of the higher branches, its black eyes blinking down at them. It cawed once, sharp and piercing, before lifting off into the brightening sky. Thomas closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to the cool glass. He didn't know why, but as he stood there, a single silent tear rolling down his cheek, he felt certain of one thing. Something was waking up in that tree. And it wasn't their daughter. The days that followed settled into a strange, suspended calm. Elise spent every waking hour sitting beneath the oak tree, watching the green buds swell and darken along the edges. Each morning, Thomas woke to the sight of her hunched figure out the window, her silhouette almost becoming part of the trunk itself. He tried not to look. He tried not to think. On the 5th day he walked out to her after coffee, steam rising from his chipped mug in thin gray tendrils. The grass was damp with dew, soaking the hems of his jeans. Elise didn't turn when he approached. Her eyes were locked on the bud, her fingers twitching with restless anticipation. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but the words curled up in his throat and died there. All he could see was her back, trembling slightly with each breath. When he finally forced himself to glance at the bud, his stomach twisted. It had grown thicker overnight, stretching into a small knotted lump the size of an apple, its surface shiny and pale green veined with brown ridges. Something about it felt wrong. It protruded from the bark at a perfect height for Lila to have reached out and touched it. "Elise," he said quietly. It's getting bigger. She's getting stronger," Elise whispered without looking at him. "Don't you see it? She's fighting her way back." He swallowed hard, tasting acid rise in his throat. "It's a tree, Elise. That's what trees do." "She was always strong," Elise continued as though he hadn't spoken. Her voice took on a dreamy lilt, soft and far away. "Even when she was born early. They said she wouldn't survive, but she did. She just needs our help again." Thomas felt a sudden flare of anger, hot and dangerous. He opened his mouth to snap back but stopped when he heard footsteps behind them. Turning, he saw Mr. Harrington walking up the driveway, his old corduroy jacket flapping slightly in the breeze. His wrinkled face looked carved from wood itself, each deep line shadowed under the bright morning sun. "Morning," Harrington said gruffly, nodding towards the oak. "Thought I'd come pay my respects again. Beautiful tree." Thomas forced a tight smile. "Morning." Harrington stepped closer to the trunk and squinted at the swelling lump. His brow furrowed, mouth tightening into a thin line. "What's that?" Elise looked up at him, her eyes wide and bright. "It's her. She's growing back." The old man stared at her for a long moment before turning his gaze to Thomas. "You need to cut that off," he said quietly, voice like gravel sliding down concrete. "Don't let it grow." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "Bad things take root in grief," Harrington murmured, almost too softly to hear. "Don't feed it." Before Thomas could respond, Harrington shook his head and walked away, his steps crunching down the gravel driveway until he disappeared behind the hedges. Thomas watched him go, a cold tightness clenching his chest. That night he dreamt of the tree again. In the dream, Lila stood under its branches, her small face pale as paper, her eyes dark and unfathomable. She reached out towards him with thin twig-like fingers, her voice echoing strangely as she whispered, "Help me grow up again, Daddy." He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. For a long moment, he lay staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the room, feeling as though his heart might rupture in his chest. When the sun rose, he walked out barefoot across the cold grass towards the tree. The lump had doubled in size overnight. Its surface was darker now, almost the tone of skin, smooth with faint hairline cracks along the top. Taking a trembling breath, he reached out and ran his thumb along the ridges. The texture was sickeningly familiar. Without thinking, he pressed harder, scraping his nail against the surface. A thin cut opened up and a milky sap oozed out, dripping onto his knuckles. He brought it to his nose and inhaled. For a moment, his legs nearly buckled. The scent was sweet and floral with an undertone of vanilla, the exact smell of Lila's shampoo. The one she insisted on using every bath night. He staggered back, wiping his hand furiously against his jeans, his pulse hammering so hard he thought he might faint. Behind him, he heard the creak of the screen door. Elise stood in her faded nightgown, her hair tangled around her shoulders, eyes wide and shining. She didn't say a word as she walked past him, sinking to her knees before the bud, her thin hands hovering just inches away as though in prayer. That evening, as darkness folded itself around the yard, Thomas sat on the porch in a rusted lawn chair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. He watched Elise through the gloom. She sat cross-legged under the tree, humming softly, her voice threading through the rustling leaves like silk through old cloth. At some point in the night he must have dozed off. He woke to the sound of her lullaby drifting through the still air. The moon hung low and swollen, its pale light illuminating the yard with an otherworldly glow. Squinting through the shadows, he saw her cradling the lump against the tree, her face pressed so close he couldn't see where her skin ended and the bark began. "Mama's here," she whispered, rocking back and forth. "Mama's here. It's okay. Mama's here." Thomas felt something tighten deep in his chest. For a fleeting moment, he saw Lila's small form there instead of Elise, curled against the tree, her hair tangled with leaves, her face buried in the rough bark. He blinked and it was just Elise again, sobbing quietly into the trunk. He closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the chair. The breeze carried the scent of oak and earth and something else, something sweet and rotting all at once. Inside his chest, his heart beat with the heavy rhythm of dread. He felt the certainty of it settle in his bones, cold and unmovable. Something was growing in that tree, and it wanted them to believe it was her. Thomas woke before dawn with his heart racing against his ribs like a trapped bird. A sliver of pale morning light pushed through the blinds, painting thin white lines across the bedroom wall. For a moment he lay still, listening to the oppressive silence. Then he heard it, a faint melody drifting through the cracked window. Elisa's voice, low and rhythmic, weaving lullabies into the pre-dawn gloom. He forced himself out of bed. His feet felt heavy against the cold wooden floor as he pulled on yesterday's jeans and stepped outside. The grass was slick with dew, soaking his socks as he trudged towards the tree. Elise sat cross-legged at its base, her hair tangled around her face, her nightgown plastered to her legs with moisture. She rocked back and forth, humming softly. Thomas's gaze fell to the lump protruding from the trunk. His breath caught in his throat. Overnight, the surface had smoothed out, losing its knotted, bark-like ridges. The shape was unmistakable now, small, round, and softly contoured. As the dawn light brightened, shadows shifted across it, revealing the faint curve of a nose, the gentle rise of closed eyelids, the parted shape of a mouth. The world narrowed to a pinprick of horror. It was Lila's face. He stumbled backwards, bile rising in his throat. Elise turned towards him, her eyes wild with elation, her lips trembling. "She's here," she whispered, reaching out to stroke the pale wooden cheek. "Do you see her? She came back to us." Thomas shook his head violently. No, Elise. That isn't her. It can't be." "It's her," Elise insisted, her voice shaking. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean lines through the dirt on her cheeks. "She's trying to speak to us. I hear her at night. She wants us to help her come back." Thomas backed away from them both, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He turned and walked quickly to the house, fighting the urge to scream. The kitchen felt suffocatingly small as he paced back and forth, clutching at his hair. He thought about the old neighbor's words, "Don't let it grow. Bad things take root in grief." His pulse hammered as a single thought thudded through his mind. He needed help. By midday, he had driven into town to the small white chapel at the end of Main Street. Father Gabriel was sweeping the stone steps when Thomas approached, his face pale and drawn. "Father," Thomas rasped. I need you to come with me. Please." The priest laid his broom aside, studying Thomas with quiet concern. Without asking questions, he wiped his hands on his robe and followed him to the truck. The drive back felt suffocatingly long. Neither spoke. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Father Gabriel stepped out slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the yard until they rested on the oak. Elise still sat under its branches, humming softly to the face in the bark. Father Gabriel approached carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal. When he saw the smooth pale features pressed into the trunk, he inhaled sharply and crossed himself. What is that?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Elise turned to him, her expression luminous with hope. "It's Lila," she whispered. "She's coming back." The priest shook his head, stepping back. "That is no child of God," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I've read of such things in old texts. Spirits that wear the faces of the dead to lure the grieving. That is not your daughter." Elise's face twisted into a snarl so sudden it startled both men. "You don't know anything," she spat, her voice shrill and cracking. "She needs me. She needs us. Thomas reached out to her, his fingers brushing her thin shoulder. Elise, please. Listen to him. This isn't right. She jerked away from his touch as though burned. Father Gabriel turned to Thomas, his face pale. Don't let it grow any further, he said urgently. If it completes itself, there will be no turning back. That night, Thomas sat alone in the living room, staring at the wall until his vision blurred. Elise refused to come inside. From the window he saw her curled against the tree trunk, her body trembling with silent sobs. A sense of helplessness pressed down on him, suffocating in its finality. He sipped stale whiskey, each swallow burning his throat raw. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, painting Elise and the tree in shifting grays. Thomas closed his eyes, letting exhaustion pull him under. His dreams were filled with darkness and muffled screaming. In the dream he stood beneath the oak tree. The face in the bark turned to him slowly, its eyelids peeling open to reveal deep black hollows. The mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. From deep within the trunk, he heard Lila's voice crying out, muffled as if underwater. Daddy. Daddy, help me. I can't breathe. He woke with a strangled gasp, heart hammering against his ribs. The clock on the wall read 3:12 a.m. For a moment he sat frozen, sweat dripping down his spine. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound drifting through the open window. It was rhythmic, insistent, like fingernails scraping wood. Thomas stumbled to his feet and moved to the window. The moon cast everything in stark silver light. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the tree. The bark below the face was scored with dozens of small fresh scratches, lines gouged deep into the wood. They clustered around the base of the lump like desperate claw marks. He felt bile rise in his throat as he imagined tiny fingernails tearing at the bark from within. Elise sat unmoving beneath the face, her head tilted up, her lips moving in silent prayer or conversation. Her hair hung around her face like a shroud. The night breeze rustled the leaves above her, their whispers threading through the darkness like a language he could almost understand but desperately didn't want to. Thomas pressed his forehead to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. A deep, gnawing dread settled in his chest, rooting itself into his bones. He felt it bloom cold and wide, spreading icy tendrils through his lungs until it hurt to breathe. The scratches in the bark glistened wetly in the moonlight. Each groove curved and twisted with desperate intention. Each line seemed to form the silent screaming plea of something trapped. He watched until dawn began to creep over the horizon, bleeding pale gold across the yard. The scratching stopped just as the first rays of light touched the tree. Elise rose stiffly and turned towards the house. Her eyes met his through the window. For a moment, her expression was utterly blank, empty as the black holes behind the bark's eyelids. Then her mouth twitched into a small, broken smile before she turned back to the tree, laying her hand gently against Lila's face. Thomas sank to his knees on the cold wooden floor, pressing trembling fingers against his mouth to keep from screaming. The rising sun cast long thin shadows through the kitchen, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the golden light. He knew, with a certainty that rotted him from the inside out, that this was only the beginning. And whatever it was that was waking in that tree, it was almost ready to open its eyes. The morning air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Thomas hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blackened bottom of his coffee mug as though it contained answers he was too afraid to ask. Outside, Elise's lullabies drifted through the fog, her voice thin and cracked. Each note felt like a needle driven into his skull. When he finally stepped onto the porch, the sun was already clawing its way up through the trees, burning the mist to tatters. He squinted into the pale light. The tree loomed before him, vast and ancient, its branches reaching towards the house like twisted skeletal arms. Elise knelt at its base, her head pressed to the lump in the trunk. Her lips moved soundlessly. The face had changed again overnight. Where once there was only the suggestion of features, now there was unmistakable animation. Its eyelids trembled with minute flickers, the lashes fine and dark against pale wooden skin. The mouth hung slightly open, corners twitching as though fighting to form words. Sap oozed from its nostrils in thick viscous trails, dripping onto Elise's hair as she rocked back and forth beneath it. Thomas felt nausea coil in his gut like a nest of snakes. He forced himself to walk closer, each step a conscious battle against the instinct screaming at him to run. Elise looked up as he approached. Her eyes were wide and red-rimmed, fever-bright with hope and madness. "She spoke to me last night," she whispered, her voice shaking with desperate joy. She said she's almost ready, Tom. She just needs a little more help. He swallowed the acid rising in his throat. Help? What do you mean? Elise reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a small paring knife, its blade rust-streaked and dirty. Before he could react, she pressed it to her thumb and sliced a deep line across the pad. Dark blood welled instantly, dripping onto the grass. She pressed her bleeding thumb to the tree's lips. The face twitched, its eyelids fluttering as sap and blood mingled, seeping into the cracks of its wooden skin. She's hungry, Elise whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. She needs me. Thomas staggered back while burning his throat. He turned and walked quickly to the house, slamming the door behind him. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he clutched the counter for support. For a long time he stood there, staring at the yellowed tiles beneath his feet, his mind a roaring blank. When he finally moved, it was with a numb, mechanical purpose. He sat at the old desktop computer in the corner of the living room, its screen dusty and faintly flickering. His fingers trembled as he typed. Tree spirit wearing dead child's face. Dozens of folklore sites appeared, their titles stark in the dim light. Changeling myths, root spirits of Eastern Europe, forest parasites that mimic the dead. He clicked through each one, his eyes burning with exhaustion as he scanned the texts. One passage froze his blood. It described a creature called a rootling, an ancient parasite that attached to dying trees, feeding on decay and grief. Sometimes, it said, these spirits would choose hosts' mourning and untimely death. They grew faces to lure the grieving close, absorbing their blood and devotion until they could form bodies of flesh, bark, and root. Once fully emerged, they were neither child nor tree but something else entirely. He read the final line 3 times, each repetition hammering cold dread deeper into his spine. Once a rootling takes the face of your dead, it can never be removed without destroying the host tree, and the soul it has trapped within. Outside, Elise's lullaby rose in pitch, breaking on a sob. Thomas slammed the laptop shut and stood abruptly, the chair clattering to the floor behind him. He grabbed his old wood axe from the shed and marched across the yard. The blade was dull from years of neglect, its wooden handle splintered. But it would have to be enough. Elise saw him coming. Her eyes widened with terror as she scrambled to her feet, placing herself between him and the tree. No, Tom. Don't hurt her. She's almost back. He didn't speak. His pulse roared in his ears as he raised the axe. The morning sun flared off the steel as he brought it down against the trunk with a dull, jarring thud. The face in the bark twisted, its mouth opening in a soundless scream. Sap sprayed out, splattering his arms and chest with sticky warmth. Elise shrieked, clawing at his shoulders, pounding her fists against his chest. Stop. You're killing her. You're killing our baby. He shoved her away, tears blurring his vision as he swung again. The blade bit deep into the wood beside the face, cracking through inner rings. The face contorted, eyelids fluttering wildly. Sap poured from its nostrils and mouth, reeking of rot and spoiled milk. As he pulled back for another strike, Elise lunged at him with her knife. The blade carved a shallow gash across his cheek. Pain flared white-hot, shocking him into dropping the axe. It thudded onto the mossy roots as he staggered back, clutching his bleeding face. Elise stood over him, her chest heaving with ragged sobs, the knife shaking in her hand. Don't you see? She cried, voice breaking. She's here, Tom. She needs us. She's alive. He pressed his palm to his cheek, feeling warm blood trickle down his jaw. The taste of copper filled his mouth as tears blurred his vision. Elise turned back to the tree, dropping to her knees. She pressed both hands to the face, whispering feverish apologies. Sap dripped onto her shoulders like thick tears. Above them, the branches swayed in the wind, their leaves whispering in a language older than human grief. Thomas crawled backwards across the grass, his limbs trembling with exhaustion and horror. He reached the porch steps and pulled himself up, collapsing against the railing. The wound on his cheek burned with every rapid heartbeat. He pressed his sleeve to it, staring through the tears at his wife in the tree. The face's mouth moved again, and this time he heard it, a low, guttural croak that rasped out into the morning air. Ma, eh. Elise sobbed with joy, pressing kisses against the wood. Mama's here, baby. Mama's here. Thomas felt the last remnants of hope drain from his chest, leaving only hollow, shaking dread. His gaze flicked up to the branches twisting above them, and for a brief, gut-churning moment, he thought he saw them bending down towards Elise, curling around her shoulders in a lover's embrace. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows behind him, sending dead leaves skittering across the porch. The sky overhead had darkened, clouds gathering in bruised purple swirls. The world felt suspended, breathless with anticipation. Elisa's lullaby rose once more, soft and broken. The face's eyes fluttered open, revealing dark pits dripping with sap. Its mouth moved, forming silent shapes, trying to remember how to speak. Roots trembled at the base of the tree, pushing up through the soil like restless fingers. Thomas pressed his head into his hands, sobs tearing through him in silent convulsions. Deep down, beneath the grief, beneath the guilt, a cold certainty settled into his bones like poison. This was no resurrection. No reunion. Something was crawling its way out of the tree. And it wasn't Lila. The wind howled through the trees that night, bending their black silhouettes against a bruised sky lit only by lightning flickering on the horizon. Rain lashed the windows in furious sheets. Inside the dim kitchen, Thomas sat at the table, his blood-caked sleeve pressed to the wound on his cheek, watching water drip from his hair onto the floorboards. His entire body trembled with feverish exhaustion. Each gust of wind rattled the window panes and made the walls creak as though the house itself was recoiling from what waited in the yard. He thought about calling someone. The sheriff. The local priest. The old neighbor, Harrington. But what would he say? That something was growing in his tree with his dead daughter's face? That his wife was feeding it blood and lullabies until it learned how to smile again? He pressed his hands to his eyes, feeling the grit-encrusted blood scratch against his lids. The darkness behind his eyelids was swirling and alive, echoing with his daughter's voice calling from the black. "Daddy. Daddy, help me, it hurts in here." A sudden crash of thunder rattled the cabinets. He flinched, lowering his hands to see Elise standing at the doorway, soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, her white nightgown translucent against her thin body. She was barefoot, mud streaking her ankles, and her eyes burned with something feral and bright. "She's almost out," she whispered hoarsely. "She's coming back to us tonight." Thomas felt his heart stutter against his ribs, a painful, lurching throb. "Elise," he rasped. "That thing, it isn't her. It's not Lila." She shook her head violently, stepping forward, her wet feet slapping the wooden floor with each step. "Don't say that. Don't you dare say that. She needs us. She's been calling for us all night." Lightning flashed again, illuminating her face in stark blue light. Her pupils were blown wide, her mouth trembling with desperate hope. Without another word, she turned and ran out into the storm. Thomas sat frozen for only a heartbeat before surging to his feet, nearly knocking the chair to the floor. The screen door slammed open against the wind as he stumbled out into the cold night. Rain hammered down on him, soaking his clothes instantly, chilling him to the marrow. He could barely see through the sheets of water driving sideways across the yard. The tree loomed ahead, lit in brief jagged bursts by the lightning that tore across the sky. Elise knelt at its base, her hands clawing at the roots, ripping up sod and mud with frantic force. Her sobs were lost beneath the wind's roar. Thomas stumbled closer, slipping in the wet grass. His eyes fixed on the face in the tree. It had changed again. The skin was now a pale, pulsing ivory, slick with sap and rain. Its eyes were open, black pits weeping thick amber tears. The mouth moved slowly, lips stretching into shapes that no longer belonged to a child. "Ma, it croaked in a voice that was neither wood nor flesh but a sick parody of both. Elise let out a strangled scream of joy. "She's talking. She's almost here." Thomas fell to his knees beside her, his hands sinking into the mud. The roots writhed beneath his fingers, flexing like muscle, pulling apart the soil as they pushed upwards. Between them, something pale and slick rose from the darkness. It was a body half-formed, its limbs twisted with strips of bark and writhing root fibers, its belly smooth and round like wet wood polished to a shine. Atop its shoulders sat Lila's perfect face, eyes closed, lips moving in silent mimicry. Elise reached out, her bloody fingers trembling as they brushed against its cheek. Its eyes snapped open. Two gleaming black orbs fixed directly onto hers. For a heartbeat, her face flooded with radiant joy. Then it moved. The creature lunged forward with impossible speed. Its long root-fused limbs wrapped around Elise, dragging her against its chest. She gasped, clutching at its arms, tears mingling with rain on her cheeks. "Lila, baby, you're here, you're really here?" The creature's mouth opened wider, stretching impossibly far until the skin split down the sides. Inside its maw was only darkness lined with pulsing, jagged roots dripping clear sap. A sharp, wet cracking echoed through the yard as a thick root burst from its chest and drove itself into Elise's sternum. Her breath left her in a single choked cry. She sagged against it as the root pulsed, drawing something out of her with each rhythmic contraction. Her hair floated in the storm winds like seaweed in black water. Her eyes rolled back. Her lips twitched, mouthing silent prayers to something that had never been her daughter. Thomas screamed. The sound tore from his chest with raw, broken force. He scrambled backwards through the mud, slipping and falling onto his back. The creature turned its gaze on him. Its head lolled to the side, Lila's features smiling through slack, trembling lips. It began to crawl towards him, dragging Elisa's limp body in its arms. Each movement was jerky and wrong, its limbs creaking with the sound of wet roots snapping under strain. He clawed at the mud, pushing himself back until his hand landed on something solid. He glanced down and saw the old wood axe half buried near the roots. His fingers closed around the handle. Without thinking, he rolled onto his knees and surged forward, raising the axe high above his head. The creature opened its mouth in a silent scream. Its body convulsed, roots whipping outwards to wrap around his ankles. He felt them squeeze, crushing bone, but he brought the axe down with all his strength. The blade sank deep into the thing's neck with a wet, splintering crack. Sap sprayed across his face, blinding him with its sickly sweetness. The creature shrieked in a chorus of layered voices, Lila's among them, shrill and terrified. He wrenched the axe free and swung again. This time the blade cut through half its chest. The creature spasmed violently, dropping Elisa's body to the mud. Its root limbs lashed out, tearing into his calf, ripping skin and muscle, but he screamed through the pain and brought the axe down a third time, severing the head completely. The creature fell silent. Its limbs collapsed beneath it, roots unraveling into the mud like dead vines. The face in the severed head blinked once, mouth twitching into a final broken smile before its features split apart, crumbling into rotting wood and black fungal growths. The body convulsed once, then slumped forward, sagging into a pile of rotting bark and twitching root fibers. Thomas fell to his knees beside Elise. Rain plastered her hair to her face, washing blood from the gaping wound in her chest. Her eyes were open, staring at the sky, lips parted around a silent final breath. He pressed his forehead to hers, sobbing into her cooling skin as lightning tore across the sky again and again. The tree above them groaned under the force of the storm. Its trunk split with a loud, echoing crack, and flames erupted along its base. Thomas blinked in confusion until he saw the can of gasoline tipped over beside him, its metal sides dented and splattered with rain. He didn't remember bringing it out. He didn't remember lighting the match. But as he watched the flames curl upwards, engulfing the creature's remains and climbing the twisted trunk, he felt only a numb, aching relief. The wind screamed through the branches, carrying with it a cacophony of voices shrieking in fury and grief. Sap bubbled and hissed as it burned, filling the air with a cloying sweetness that turned his stomach. Sparks drifted into the storm, carried into the blackness beyond the yard. Thunder rolled overhead, vibrating the earth beneath his knees. He crawled backwards through the mud, dragging himself away from the inferno until he reached the porch steps. He collapsed against them, his chest heaving, his blood mixing with rainwater in the grass. Flames roared higher, devouring the ancient oak from within, sending columns of oily black smoke spiraling into the lightning-lit sky. Hours later, when the storm finally passed and dawn broke pale and silent across the yard, Thomas still sat there, unmoving. Fire crews arrived to find the tree burned to a charred, skeletal husk, its roots cracked and smoking in the damp soil. Elise lay lifeless nearby, her white nightgown stained crimson and brown. Thomas stared at the smoldering remains with hollow eyes, lips moving in silent prayer or curse. When they lifted him onto a stretcher, he didn't resist. His gaze stayed locked on the scorched stump as they carried him away. His voice cracked through dry lips, barely audible. She wasn't alone in there. No one replied. They didn't understand. They never would. Far beneath the blackened earth, hidden from the rising sun, a single thin white root twitched in the dark soil. Slowly, delicately, it pushed upwards. At its tip formed a tiny bud. Pale and wet, it began to peel open. Inside, a small smiling face waited for dawn.